You know what's fascinating? The stress you feel right now, scrolling through your phone, worrying about deadlines, feeling exhausted even after a full night's sleep. That sensation isn't new. It's ancient, and I mean that literally. 2,000 years ago, in the heart of the Roman Empire, people were experiencing something eerily similar to what we call burnout today. If you're curious about how the most powerful civilization on Earth dealt with chronic stress and what their brains were actually going through, you're in exactly the right place. So subscribe to this channel because we're about to explore a deep dive into the neuroscience of Roman stress and how it connects directly to the burnout you might be feeling right now. Let's start with what burnout actually is from a neurological perspective. Burnout isn't just feeling tired. It's a specific state where your brain's stress response system has been activated so intensely and for so long that it stops working properly. Your amygdala, the almond-shaped structure deep in your brain that processes fear and threat, becomes hyperactive. Your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational thinking and decision-making, starts to shut down. Your cortisol levels, the stress hormone, become chronically elevated. And when this happens day after day, month after month, your entire nervous system gets rewired. Your brain literally changes. This isn't metaphorical. This is biology. Now, here's where Rome comes in. The Roman Empire, particularly during its height from the 1st to 3rd centuries, was a high-pressure environment that would make any modern corporate office look quaint. Consider the life of a Roman senator or administrator. These men weren't just dealing with political pressure. They were managing an empire that stretched across 3 continents. They had no email, sure, but they also had no ability to delegate through technology. Every message required a messenger on horseback. Every decision was made in real time, face-to-face, often with military or political consequences. A mistake wasn't just embarrassing, it could cost you your life. Take the case of a Roman general stationed on the frontier. He's responsible for thousands of soldiers. The barbarian tribes beyond the border are always a threat. He has to maintain discipline, manage resources that are often inadequate, deal with supply chain problems that can take months to resolve, and do all of this while knowing that if the border falls, Rome's entire security network is compromised. His stress isn't abstract, it's existential, and his body knows it. Let's talk about what happens in the Roman brain under this kind of pressure. When a Roman soldier marches into battle, or when a senator enters the forum knowing his political rivals are waiting, his amygdala fires up immediately. His heart rate increases. Blood flows away from his digestive system and into his muscles. His pupils dilate. His mind sharpens. This is the fight-or-flight response, and it's absolutely essential for survival. For short periods, this system is perfect. It keeps you alive. But here's the neurological problem that Romans faced, just like you do today. If the threat never goes away, your body doesn't return to baseline. The amygdala stays active. Cortisol levels remain high. Your prefrontal cortex, which normally keeps the amygdala in check, gets exhausted from constantly trying to regulate the threat response. Over time, this creates a vicious cycle. Your brain becomes more reactive. You become hypervigilant. You see threats everywhere, even when they're not there. A critical comment from a superior isn't just feedback. It feels like a personal attack. A small setback feels catastrophic. Roman physicians, though they didn't have the vocabulary we have today, actually understood something about this. They observed that soldiers returning from long campaigns often suffered from what they called melancholia, a condition of persistent low mood, fatigue, and emotional numbness. They didn't know about cortisol or the prefrontal cortex, but they knew that chronic stress changed people. Some soldiers became irritable and aggressive. Others became withdrawn and depressed. Some couldn't sleep. Others slept constantly but never felt rested. Sound familiar? This is burnout. One of the most illuminating examples comes from the life of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher-emperor. Marcus ruled Rome during one of its most turbulent periods. The Antonine Plague was devastating the empire. Germanic tribes were pressing on the northern border. The economy was unstable, and Marcus, despite his philosophical training, documented his own struggle with the burden of leadership in his private journals, the text we now know as Meditations. He writes repeatedly about anxiety, about the weight of responsibility, about the difficulty of maintaining perspective when everything feels urgent and important. What's remarkable is that Marcus was training his brain using proto-cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. He was essentially trying to override his amygdala's threat detection by consciously reframing his thoughts. He would remind himself that most of what he worried about never actually happened. He would practice negative visualization, imagining worst-case scenarios so that he could see them rationally rather than emotionally. He was, in essence, trying to strengthen his prefrontal cortex through philosophical practice. This is exactly what modern neuroscience now recommends for burnout recovery. But Marcus Aurelius had something most modern burnout sufferers don't have. He had time and space to practice these techniques. He had philosophers and friends to discuss his stress with. He had the authority to delegate some of his burden. He had Stoic philosophy as a framework for understanding his experience. Most Romans didn't have these luxuries. And that's where we see the real burnout crisis in the ancient world. Consider the life of a Roman clerk or scribe working in the imperial bureaucracy. Rome's administrative system was vast and complex. Everything had to be documented. Taxes had to be collected. Legal disputes had to be recorded. Correspondence had to be maintained. These administrative workers had to be precise, attentive, and reliable. They worked long hours in cramped spaces. They had minimal job security. If they made mistakes, they could be dismissed or worse. They had repetitive tasks that required intense focus. They couldn't afford to have an off day. Sound like modern office work? It absolutely does. The neurological reality for these Roman workers was similar to what we see today in people with burnout. They had chronic activation of the stress response system. They had limited recovery time. They had social hierarchies that they couldn't escape. They had deadlines and quotas they had to meet. And they had very little control over their circumstances. This combination, high demand, low control, and limited recovery, is the exact recipe for burnout according to modern stress research. Let's talk about sleep, because this is crucial to understanding both ancient and modern burnout. Your brain needs sleep to consolidate memories, regulate emotions, and restore depleted neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. During sleep, your amygdala quiets down. Your prefrontal cortex gets to rest and rebuild. Your cortisol levels drop. Your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest system, gets to do its job. But when you're in a state of chronic stress, sleep becomes difficult. You lie awake ruminating about problems. Your amygdala stays partially active, even during sleep. Your dreams become intense and sometimes nightmarish. You wake up not feeling rested because your nervous system never fully switched off. Roman soldiers on campaign would have experienced this intensely. They couldn't afford to fully relax their vigilance. They slept in shifts. They slept in armor or near their weapons. Their amygdala was literally on guard duty 24 hours a day. Some soldiers would develop what we might now call insomnia or sleep disturbance. They would become irritable and emotionally dysregulated. Their decision-making would suffer. And as their cognitive function declined, their stress increased because they couldn't perform their duties as well. This is another vicious cycle of burnout. Now let's talk about social connection, because this is where ancient Rome and modern burnout intersect in a really important way. Your brain is a social brain. When you feel connected to others, when you feel understood and supported, your nervous system downregulates. Your amygdala quiets down. Your cortisol levels drop. This is called social buffering, and it's one of the most powerful stress reduction mechanisms your brain has. Conversely, when you feel isolated, when you feel like nobody understands what you're going through, your stress response intensifies. In ancient Rome, particularly for soldiers and administrators, social isolation was common despite being surrounded by other people. A general couldn't really confide in his subordinates about his doubts and fears because it would undermine his authority. A clerk couldn't truly relax with his colleagues because they were also competing for limited advancement opportunities. There was a kind of hierarchical loneliness that pervaded Roman society. You might be surrounded by people, but you couldn't truly connect with them in authentic ways. This is something that many modern burnout sufferers report as well. They feel isolated even in busy workplaces. Let's consider what happened to the body of a Roman under chronic stress at a biochemical level. Your sympathetic nervous system releases norepinephrine and epinephrine, adrenaline and noradrenaline. where adrenal glands release cortisol. These hormones are useful for short bursts of activity, but when they're constantly elevated, they cause damage. Cortisol suppresses your immune system, so you get sick more easily. It impairs your memory formation, so you have trouble concentrating. It increases inflammation in your body, so you develop pain and illness. It disrupts your metabolism, so you might gain weight or lose your appetite. It affects your digestion, so you have stomach problems. All of this would have been visible in the bodies of stressed Romans, even if they didn't understand the biochemistry behind it. We actually have some evidence of this from skeletal remains and contemporary accounts. Roman soldiers showed signs of repetitive stress injuries, bone density loss, and evidence of chronic illness. Roman administrators and wealthy individuals often suffered from gout, digestive problems, and insomnia, all conditions exacerbated by chronic stress. There's even evidence that some Roman emperors developed what might have been anxiety disorders or depression. The physical cost of chronic stress was visible in ancient Rome, just as it is today. Let's talk about decision fatigue, because this is a neurological phenomenon that would have absolutely affected Romans in positions of power. Your prefrontal cortex has a limited amount of executive function available each day. Every decision you make depletes this resource a little bit. By the end of the day, or after making many significant decisions, your ability to make good decisions declines sharply. You become more impulsive, you become more emotional, you become more prone to errors. This is why successful people often develop routines and systems to preserve their decision-making capacity for the things that matter most. A Roman emperor or general had to make hundreds of consequential decisions every single day. Should I promote this man or that man? Should I send troops to this location or that location? Should I be merciful or harsh in this judgment? Unlike a modern CEO who can delegate some decisions or use data analytics, a Roman leader often had to make these decisions based on incomplete information and with enormous consequences. The neurological burden of this would have been substantial. By evening, the emperor's prefrontal cortex would have been completely depleted, and if he had to make critical decisions the next morning, he'd be starting from a deficit. This is a setup for burnout. There's also the issue of what we might call role burden, the gap between who you actually are and who you have to be in your position. A Roman emperor couldn't show weakness, doubt, or vulnerability. A soldier couldn't admit fear. An administrator couldn't show frustration. They had to maintain a facade of competence and control at all times. This constant self-regulation is exhausting for the brain. It requires constant engagement of the prefrontal cortex to suppress emotions and maintain composure. This is called emotional labor, and it's a significant contributor to burnout. If you like the video so far, please hit that like button because understanding the neuroscience of how ancient stress mirrors modern burnout is genuinely valuable knowledge. Because this is crucial to understanding why some Romans handled stress better than others. Your brain needs meaning. When you believe your suffering is for something important, your brain handles that suffering differently.